So now we're going to take a look at the other kind of layers, procedural layers, and we're going to do that in a new scene. So let's just hit Control N. Let me just pull up the on-screen keyboard one more time. And we're going to go to the modeling toolbar, create, and throw in a new sphere. And we'll do a torus as well. Just move that over. So first thing we're going to do as usual is create new material groups. And we're going to go into our shading panel once again. And for the torus here, we're going to go to add layer, and instead of going to image map, we're going to click on one of these inside the enhance MODO textures section here. There are a bunch of other ones. We're not going to get too deep into them, but there are different layers to put in gradients and specifically color different parts of geometry, make it look like particles, make it look like clouds, things like that. But for our purposes right now, also to make it look like fur is another common one. We're going to kind of focus on the textures here and the enhanced MODO textures here. So let's just grab one from noise. We'll go with flow bozo, and you're going to see that's not going to update here, but it will update in our render. And this layer is going to show a kind of black and white checkerboard indicating that it is not an image based layer. And you'll see again by default it's going to override our diffuse color value. Right? Let's do another material over here. Now just so you know, if we pull up the documentation, let me pull that up once again. If we search for enhance MODO, we should see a section for enhanced MODO textures, and this page has thumbnails for kind of to give you an idea of what these different textures will or could give you as a result. So for example, we have plates here. Now that this image is using orange and white, but most of them default to black and white, and you should also keep in mind that the results here might not be what you get out of the box, so you might have to play around with some of the values in the layer itself. But yeah, let's put in this plates panel. By the way, if you click any of these, it will show you what all the different values in the textures do. We're not going to get too deep into that, but we are just going to play around with them for now. So on my sphere material, I'm going to go to add layer, and I'm just going to search for plates rather. And you can see it's not quite the same texture as I was seeing on the documentation, but that's okay. If we look at the properties for this, we can kind of play around with it. Might not give me kind of the result I'm looking for. Let's see. Alright, so plate distribution is kind of where those plates show up. The grout width is kind of the lines around the plates. So if we were to go back to 100% and then increase our grout width, we should start to see those lines get kind of thicker. Yep. What I want to do is change the size of those plates. So let's actually change the repeats here. And to be perfectly honest, this is one of the layers that I've never played with before, so I'm kind of looking at this as I go along. There's just so many in there that you can kind of play around with and get really interesting results with. So it's definitely worth kind of checking out and exploring. Alright, so we'll go with something like that. That will be fine. And now if we just zoom out a little bit, we have these two layers, right? We can do a lot of different things. We can of course change the color in them. right? We can just say like, oh, I want this to be orange and let's do black and kind of have that. And already that's a lot more interesting than just a flat orange or a flat black, right? Um, I don't have any external files for these, so that's great. I also do want to note for these procedural materials or layers rather, we're going to have a projection type of solid by default, and you should be fine leaving it on that. If you want to kind of tweak the result based on the numbers you already have, you can always change the noise seed value, and that will basically recalculate the same kind of setup that you have from a different base value and give you a slightly different looking result. It's kind of good if you just don't like what you got out of the box. You can just switch that around and it will change it quite a bit with each increment. Okay? Or decrease. Alright. We can also, of course, change the blending mode on this layer. So instead of being just kind of on top of that pale green, we can say like, oh, I want to make sure I'm on the right layer. I want to subtract it or add it to that layer, like kind of get a different result. And you can, of course, also say, oh, it's only kind of it's a little bit transparent over the layer beneath it, so you can kind of get different results there. These layers will also have their own texture locator underneath them that you can move around and change the same way we did before. But what's kind of more interesting is the idea of using these to drive values other than your color. So I'm going to actually hide this torus for now and just focus on my sphere. Let's hide that, select my sphere. I'm also going to go into my shading and just turn off the environment so I have a little bit more dramatic lighting, which we'll talk about. Actually, let's not do that. Let's actually just go to this shading panel and select that layer for my plates. And right now, the effect is driving my diffuse color. So it's just replacing the diffuse color on this material. However, if I want to change something else about it, I can. So I can say, instead of, let's say, changing the diffuse color, we want to change the specular color. I can click on this where it says diffuse color, click on that, and I can look for specular color, which I happen to know is in basic channels, but you can always type something in like specular and look for the right thing. So specular color. So now what's happening is my layer's color is still being driven by this color here, but the specular color is only being driven by the black and white section. If I was to change the colors in this layer, let's say to be kind of blue and purple, let's see if we can get that to show up. You can see it's a little off. You can see there's a hint of blue here. Let's change this a little bit more to something that. And let's go ahead and increase how specular this object is so we can kind of see that better. Right? There we go. So now essentially that black and white texture is red and purple, and it's going to kind of be only defining the specular color on my object. Now, not the greatest example, so let's try something else. Let's, instead of driving the specular color here, first let's reset this to black and white. Okay. Again, I'm just going to change this to diffuse color, make sure everything looks okay, and the object's very reflective, so I'm going to turn down my reflection something like that. All right, let's look at, first let's add in some kind of background to this. So I'm gonna do some quick modeling, just delete 3 polygons there, and select the other polygons here. Hit F to turn them inside out, and now I kind of at least have a background. Oops, let me just hit 5 and move this up. And I'm going to go into my shading section here again, go to the plates layer and the material underneath it. For my transparency here, I'm going to change my I'm going to change my luminous amount to 10, and remind you guys that that essentially makes the item glow. So if we go to our scene and turn off our light, and if we go to our shader and turn off our environment, you can kind of see that now the light coming off this object's luminosity is really the only thing lighting my scene. Wrong layer again. Right there. So this is the only thing lighting my scene. If I set this down to 0, it's 0, right? Now keep in mind that how this looked before when it was on diffuse color. So let me turn this back on. This layer is assigning color to my object. However, it's also assigning 2 different colors, right? You can assume that the black value here is always going to be 0, and the white value here is always going to be 1, and anything in between will be the gray value between 0 and 1. So if we were to actually say, for this layer, I know that we're going to add luminosity, right? I want to define this luminosity value with that image. So I only want the parts that are white in my layer to glow rather. I can do this by actually changing this to drive, instead of the diffuse color, I can say drive the luminous amount, right? And now all the parts that were white are emitting light, and if we turn off our directional light, see this a little bit better. And if we weren't driving the luminous color or luminous amount there, if we went back to diffuse color, you'll see the whole thing is now lit, like emitting light, and the color isn't actually showing because the luminous color here, here is white, right? So what I can do now is say, okay, I want this to do my luminous amount, and I also want, not transparent amount, basic channels, luminous amount, right? But I also want that to kind of affect the color, so I can duplicate this with Control D and say also this is going to drive my diffuse color. So now I have kind of a combination of that. Let's kind of play around. Let's look at this on another object. So we're gonna turn this guy off, open up our torus here, and make sure that that's visible again, right there. Let's move this over, hide our sphere. Our light is still off, so let's turn that back on. And I'm going to reset this, so opacity 100%. Colors will go back to white and black, so that's fine. Actually, let me invert that. So I'm going to make this white. Okay. we just drove the luminous into, amount value. Instead, in this case, we're going to try driving the transparency amount. So let's go to basic channels again and transparent amount. And we're going to turn off, or we're going to just make the base layer black here. Okay. Now you can see what's kind of happening here is only parts of this object are transparent. Maybe Flow Bozo isn't the best example of this, so I'm just going to add another layer here. So I'm going to turn that one off. Go add layer. Image map. Actually, not image map. Let's go to... I'm just going to type in here something. So add layer, check, checker. Sure, right? I have a value here that's transition width that's going to be that line right there. So if I hit that to change that to 0, you see I get a better result. Here I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say change this effect to transparent amount. And what you should see is every part that is white has a value of 1, so 100% transparency, and every value that's black will have no transparency. So if I change this to transparent amount, right away we see the black is still visible and the white is all transparent, which is honestly pretty cool looking right out of the box. And then of course we can go back to our material and start playing around with like the refractive index. So if we say something like that, now we got a bunch of weird things happening within the object. That might be too high. Let's put something like water. And if we were to throw in another shape here, that the transparent parts of this would be showing. Let's turn off the specular for now value. And you kind of get this really interesting result of just like a material that might not necessarily exist in the real world, but it almost looks like a piece of glass that's got like a painted pattern on it. And so I just kind of want you guys to understand that you can drive any of these values and channels and color values by an image so that it's not just a single value throughout the entire object. So if I wanted to, let's say, take that same layer, let's duplicate it once, Control D. Instead of just the transparent amount, we're going to drive the transparent color. And then in the white part, which is going to be the transparent part, I can change this to be red. So now all those kind of transparent areas have that reddish hue, and it's overriding this value over here, right? I can also say that instead of the black part being completely opaque by having it set to 0, I can say, oh, this part's less transparent. So maybe it's still transparent, but it is, well, actually, let me just turn this off really quickly and change this. Actually, this might need to be based on the value instead of the color alone. So I'm going to increase this value instead. There we go. So now the darker checks are only, let's say, 50% transparent. It's still transparent, but it's only 50% transparent. And then on the color here, I can change this color to, let's go with like a blue and make sure that that layer's turned back on. So now we have kind of a visible blue and a more transparent pink. It's more of a purple than a blue, I suppose. But yeah, so you can drive kind of any channel. And one of the things that's very useful with this is to drive like transparency and get a shape that's much more complicated to model than is necessary for your scene. So the example I like to use is, let's just do this in a new scene. I'm going to close that as well. We're going to throw in a cube here, and we're going to flatten this out quite a bit, something like that. We actually go to the percentage, we can just make this like 0.5, so it's pretty much a flat surface, but there is shading on both sides. I'm going to put a material on this leaf, and we're going to add an image here. So add image, image map, load image. Let's go to this guy right here. And I might be crashing MODO right now because I have been playing around for quite a bit. Nope, there we go. Alright. For this image, I'm going to do a front projection. So texture locator, instead of the UV map. Actually, instead of changing this, so I can definitely go to planar and just work with that as is. First, I'm going to scale this up a little bit. And I'm going to go to my UV layout, so I can click here again, or I can of course be in the MODO layout and just open up my UV panel. In my UV tools here, I'm just going to do a projection that says planar along the z-axis, and make sure that this is also set to UV map, and I should have the same result. I just find that when I'm not on an actual UV map as my texture projection, sometimes I get a little bit of artifacting, so I'm just keeping that in mind. Now I'm just going to duplicate this layer once. Oops, make sure that it's above my material. Control D. And here, instead of actually just using the same one, I'm going to replace this image with a leaf transparent image, right? Now, I want you guys to think about this for a second. We preview this image. The inside of the leaf is black and the outside is white. If 1 is on or yes or 100% and 0 is off, 0%, and we're looking specifically at transparency, then the white part is completely transparent and the black part is completely opaque. If we were looking at opacity, you would want to invert those, where the leaf would be white because it's 100% opaque, and the outside would be black because it's 0% opaque, right? So it's a small distinction, but it's definitely worth keeping in mind. So this is what's going to be called my transparency map. It's telling me what parts of my object are transparent. And I'm going to load that in, and it's really all I did was I went into Photoshop and I colored the leaf black, and I made sure the rest of the image was completely white. Now you can see that is still on diffuse color, so if I change this back to transparency amount, I get a much nicer result. Now you do see there's some kind of artifacting here where there's reflection on the rest of the object, so I can try to go in and change my specular amount to 0, my Fresnel value is 0, and that gives me a pretty good result that I can get away with, right? Especially depending on how far away from the camera it is. But you notice there's still like this kind of gray edge around this, so I might need to fine tune the image a little bit to cut into kind of the shape. The other option that we have here is, let's say I want this leaf to be a little bit reflective, right? I want it to have kind of some type of reflection. Let's say, where are we? Oh, specular amount, increase that kind of up to here. But now we're getting this like issue on the sides again. So one of the things we can do is, instead of driving the transparent amount, we can go in and drive a specific value called stencil, which, if I remember correctly, is under special effects. Yep. So stencil will kind of just cut out the object. And you'll notice here it's cutting out the wrong side of the object, right? Because it's saying stencil out just the white section. Instead of going into like Photoshop to invert this layer, I can actually just invert it on the layer properties. So invert that. Oops. And that's actually not giving me what I want. So let me try that again. There we go. So yeah, that should, I think it might just not have taken it the first time, but now this object is reflective, but I don't have to worry about the Fresnel value. Stencil is just going to kind of cut it out for me, and I can have it be whatever I want, right? I kind of want to show you one more little trick here, and this is a bit complicated, so if you can't follow this completely, it's totally fine. First thing I'm going to do is make a bunch of copies of this. Let's rotate this to be flat, kind of like that. Let's go to scene, select my cube, and just go to my rotation, negative 90. Alright. I'm going to duplicate this a bunch of times, so I'm going to go to my duplicate tools. I'm going to do scatter clone, click in my viewport, gives me a bunch of copies. Hit the K key to bring up my properties, and I'm going to change my range in Y to be 0, so they're all kind of on the floor like that. And I'm going to increase my range so they're a little bit more spread out. Like that. And I'm also going to rotate. Sorry, that should only be in the Y direction. 0 there, 0 there. Okay, so we'll do 180. So it's rotated from the original direction, and that's fine. And now you can kind of see we already have this effect of a bunch of leaves on the ground. Slowing down a little bit, that's okay. Put in kind of a floor. And I'm just going to put a material on this floor really quickly, so with some kind of reddish, like a brown. Okay. Alright, and let's go in and just make sure the floor isn't reflective here. Okay. Now, with these leaves that we have scattered everywhere, first thing I want to do is just merge them into one mesh item. So I'm going to select all those and merge meshes, hit OK. And there's a special texture that we have here called the variation texture. It's under processing, variation texture. The variation texture will essentially let me create a bunch of different colors for different parts of the objects that it's applied on. In this case, it's giving one color to everything because I haven't said how to differentiate what is getting a color. But in this layer, if we go to the variation section, we have this slider here. Now, it says color, but it's not like your typical color picker. This is a gradient picker. And to change that, what I'm going to have to do is click on this gear icon and hit open in editor, and that will bring up this window. Now, in this window, if I middle click anywhere here, it's going to create essentially a keyframe or another mark where the value can be different from the original value here. And if I keep clicking here, I can kind of create more and more. So again, I'm clicking down on that mouse wheel to create a new marker. And I'm just sliding these around, clicking and dragging like that. Now at each of these, I can pick a different color. So I can say, oh, a little bit of red, maybe some orange, more yellow, a little bit green, and actually get rid of this white. Let's change that to like, kind of want an orange-ish brown, something like that. And these will be kind of very deep green, like that. This one doesn't really fit in if I'm kind of going for the leaf colors of fall. Maybe we get some more reds on this side, like a darker red, something like that. Okay. So I want to essentially say pick a color from that gradient and apply it to my object. The default option for the variation source here in the variation texture is going to be particle. I'm going to change that to, instead of particle, I'm going to change that to mesh part. And each part of a mesh is essentially like an island. And since we merged all of these together, we have a bunch of islands inside of one mesh object. So you can see already that's kind of giving me the result I was looking for, in that it's just selecting the color and applying it to the object. Now, next thing we want to do here is just change our blend mode, since we don't want all the leaves to just be a solid color, right? We have that texture there, so I can kind of play around with what this does on top of the texture of the image that we had, and get like a couple of different results. You might need to go in and actually change the texture image to be like a grayscale image, and you can get kind of a nicer result that way, right? If you also want to just randomize the colors in your scene, you can definitely do that without a layer underneath. I could turn off this diffuse layer completely and then just make sure that this layer is set to normal, and I have a bunch of leaves on the floor, right? So it's a cool layer to play around with, and you can get kind of nice results with just a few clicks. Okay. So there's one more specific effect that I want to show you guys, so you can play around with it right now. It's a little bit more complicated to understand, but we'll take our best chance here. So I'm going to start with a sphere, and I'll frame it up. I'll turn off these extra view parts so that we can just kind of see what we're working on. Let's turn on smoothing, and we're going to create a new material, add a effect layer. So I'm just going to go back to, let's try textures down here. We'll go with dots. I'm okay with that. And I'm going to go to the material, turn off my specular and Fresnel values. Roughness is fine. I think this texture would kind of show what I want to do with this pretty well. I am going to change the values here to be like 50% instead of black, and I'll change that here as well, so I'll do 0.5. Okay. I'm going to also duplicate this, so I'll leave the diffuse color there, and then in this layer, instead of diffuse color, I'm going to drive a surface channel, which will go to surface shading here, and I'm going to change my bump, right? So as soon as I do that, you'll notice it's a very subtle difference that I can see if I turn this layer on and off. If we zoom in on our object, turning that on is kind of faking the idea that the white portions of the image are a little bit higher in the surface than the darker portions of the image, right? If we look at the kind of edge here, the silhouette, we notice that it's still the silhouette of the sphere. However, it looks like, you know, a part of this is sticking out or bumped out of my surface. If I go back to this layer and I change my dot color back to black and 0, you should see that becomes a little bit, whoops, 0. That becomes a little bit more dramatic a bump, right? The idea here is that if the value for the entire layer was kind of 50% gray or 50%, the entire layer would look exactly as it did without this layer turned on. And then going towards white will make the layer kind of look like it's coming up, and going towards black will make it look like it's going down. So again, this is kind of just playing with the light to fake the effect. It's not changing the shape of it, but it is going to give you this effect. Another property that comes into play here is on the material itself. You might have remembered we skipped this surface normal section here. This has a value called the bump amplitude, and that's going to be essentially how far the distance is from white to black on your bump image or bump map. And if we were to increase this to, let's say, 10 millimeters, you should see that kind of doubles in the amount of depth it fakes. Well, if we went to like 1 meter, it's going to be even more so, right? Let's now go back to 5 millimeters or 10 millimeters, let's say. Okay. Instead of driving, actually let me change that back to black because that's kind of how it was, because this is again 0, so this should also be 0. Alright, now if we have another layer like this where it's just a copy of the first, and we just want to use that second layer to change the effect without changing any of the values, we could do that by, instead of just duplicating the layer, we can right click this and we can select create instance. Now you'll notice with the instance the name is italicized, so like if I hit Control D, it just creates another layer. The italicized image is saying that it's going to be driving all its values from your original layer. So even if this is driving something like your bump map, special effects, or sorry, surface shading, bump, you'll notice these two purple, like kind of lilac purple dots here are telling me that, hey, this is an instance item and the value is being driven from somewhere else. So now if I was to change my dot value here on the original layer, and you can see that that's still going to affect my bump. It's just like, it's kind of like a reference copy of the layer, just so I can kind of point it to another effect. All right. The next thing I want to talk about here is another type of surface shading called a displacement map. So if this is our bump map, we can go to surface shading and select displacement. Now displacement is going to do kind of the same thing, however, you'll notice immediately it changes the silhouette of my object. Displacement mapping will actually change the surface of my geometry at render time. So it won't ever change here, it won't add or remove geometry here, but in my render it will actually include the white parts of my object as being raised and the black parts of my object as being pushed down a little. Alright. Again, this is still an instance, alright? So I drive all my values from my original layer, and I'm going to go to kind of a gray, and you'll notice again that color is just the color, it's not the actual value, so it's not changing how far in or out that is. So I'm going to also change my dot value to like 50%, and you see that the inside kind of looks like it moved up, right? If this was 90%, it's going to move up even more. If both of these were 50%, that's going to be essentially flat, right? Let's actually go back to black here. And actually, if the value here was 100% and this was 0, then the white parts are going to look like they're being pushed in. Okay? It's interesting that we got the brown showing up there from the original layer, which we normally wouldn't get. I'm just going to bump this up to, oh, sorry, that's why I changed the alpha value here, meaning the transparency rather than the actual value. So if I change that to 0, now the black sections are popping up because they have a value of 100, meaning it's 100% displaced, versus the white values have a value of 0, which is not at all displaced. Um, Displacements are also controlled on the material level by the surface normal section. Here I have a maximum displacement distance, so that means that at 100%, wherever that value is 100%, you're going to displace the object this distance. So if I was to change this to, let's say, a meter, which is kind of ridiculous, I immediately get this kind of sponge ball, like koosh ball type item, which is very odd. And if I was to go back to my layer here, change my black back to 0 and my white back to 100, now all the white sections are kind of bumping out. Let's try dropping this a bit. 25. It's still quite a bit much. I might just want to, instead of playing around here, go back to the material itself and just drop this to like 0.25. Yeah, let's go a little bit lower, 0.5. Or, sorry, not 0.025. Right. Okay, so, yeah, essentially a displacement map is going to fake the idea that the texture and the surface of your object has different depths, versus a bump map is just going to fake it with kind of lighting. They both kind of do take a little bit more time to process, especially with large detailed geometry. And you'll also notice that some of these results might be a little like just not the prettiest over here, for example. Sometimes hitting smoothing the item out helps a little, but just keep that in mind. There is kind of this limitation to how well your displacement maps will work out of the box, right?